Let me ask you a question. What makes someone the best player on a team? If you had to choose a stat to figure out how valuable each player was, what would you use? If we're talking about batsmen, maybe it's batting average? Or maybe strike rate? Surely, the best batter has some combination of these two that allows him to rack up the score quickly without taking too many deliveries. And what about the bowlers? Someone who can tear through an entire lineup. But of course, that doesn't matter if they're getting smacked every other ball. Economy keeps the game quiet, but if the batters aren't walking off the field, they're gonna heat up and be unstoppable. So then, what is your stat of choice to figure out what makes a player valuable? What if I told you it's something much more simple? A stat that you could apply to both batsmen and bowlers. It's something we haven't even talked about yet. A stat you won't even hear too much about. And if you do hear about it, commentators will be boasting about it for all the wrong reasons. It's money. I'm talking about cold hard cash. What does that even mean? Well, when it comes to putting together a good lineup, franchises want to maximize their return on investment. That means that they want to pay for the best possible stats. In the world of franchise cricket, we hear about insane dollars being dropped on players. It feels like every time a league auction comes around, we hear about record-breaking money being paid out for these players. And sure, these teams are willing to pay so much because they see the talent that we all do. These players are deserving of the top dollars. But for a winning side that needs to balance its stats with what it can afford, spending becomes a huge concern. Sure, you can have the biggest name batsman in your lineup, but if you spend so much money on getting him that you can't put together a balanced team, the cup will never be yours. As much as we forget about this simple fact, it's what's on the mind of every team, particularly those of the IPL, where profits are the highest. Money is pouring into the Indian Premier League like no tomorrow. In a few short years, it has become the second most profitable sports league in the world, just behind the NFL. For perspective, the IPL began in 2007. The NFL, on the other hand, has been around since 1920. In just a few short years, T20 cricket has exploded in India to become an absolute behemoth. In a 45-day span, the IPL produces the same revenues as 72 Bollywood movies combined. With how ridiculous IPL stats are, its player contracts are just insane. We all saw the news of Mitchell Starc's contract at just under $3 million. That's about $11,000 for throwing a legal delivery. In just one over of the IPL, Stark earns more money than the average American will in an entire year. That's a pretty penny for an over. And not every player is getting paid the same. So, to understand how well players performed based on the amount they were paid, we tracked every player that participated in the 2024 IPL. Yup, that's all 254 players, their salaries, and their performance stats. Here are the numbers. First, let's take a look at the bowling department. This plot tracks how much each wicket that a bowler took cost their respective team. The players that will get you a greater bang for your buck will be down at the bottom right here. Ideally, they'll also stretch to the right. These are the guys who did amazing without costing the team too much. Now, guess how much Kolkata paid for each wicket Stark took? He's over here at around $175,000 per wicket. That's just another level of wealth. With all that cash, Stark was an above average wicket taker at 1.31 wickets per innings. And in theory, this makes sense. If you want an above average player, you're going to have to pay an above average salary. But then there's guys over here, Kishore, Berger, and Naveen Al-Haq, each taking more wickets per match, and all while costing their team much less per wicket. Naveen Al-Haq's entire contract is worth only $60K. Talk about a smart investment. But what gets crazy is Stark's not even the most expensive wicket taker on the list. There's a whole class of bowlers in the six-figure club on this stat sheet. These men are the true bag chasers, setting their price per wicket in the 200K range. And yet, that doesn't hold a candle to the biggest robber of the league, the man who took the bag and ran, Deepak Chahar. In 8 innings, he took just 5 wickets, an abysmal wicket rate, all while costing $336K per wicket. Oh, and his salary? He was paid $1.7 million. Chahar basically went on a bank run during the entire season. And you might be wondering, was he at least economical? Yes and no. His average economy of 8.59 was lower than the league average of 9.6, but 21 bowlers bettered his economy. Most players compared to the ones discussed so far had much more digestible costs. But surely, the best wicket taker has to be somewhere in this upper echelon. He at least needs to be costing in the six-figure per wicket range. After all, these teams are paying for performance, right? The best wicket taker in the league took 2.17 wickets per game. He must cost something absurd. Something like, oh, wait, he's down here at just 1.8k per wicket. That's right, while everyone else was lining their pockets, Pathy Rana was gathering wickets as a hobby. In 6 innings, he collected 13 wickets. 2.17 wickets per match is literally double the average. A statistical outlier, all while being paid literally the minimum contract rate. It's safe to say that Chennai Super Kings made the single most impressive investment in the bowling side for this IPL. But what about when it comes to batting? Let's start off by taking a look at batting averages compared to how much players are paid. Again, to find the player with the best bang for your buck, you're gonna want to look at those closer at the bottom right corner here. And sure enough, you'll find a chart that, just like the bowling one, is all over the place. Looking at cost-effective players this time, Tristan Stubbs averages a wonderful 54 runs while being paid just 60k for this season. That is ridiculously impressive. He's definitely putting up wild stats for the amount he gets paid. It's no wonder he was a breakout player for South Africa in the recent World Cup. But watch what happens when we find someone with a similar average. Say, Dhoni, with an average of 53.66. Basically the same number of runs as him. But Dhoni's getting paid $1.4 million. What's happening here? And okay, before you stop me, I agree. There's clearly a lot more that Dhoni brings to the table than just his batting average. And we'll talk more about those other factors later. But just bear with me for a second. Let's keep looking and focus on the next best average on this chart, which belongs to none other than Viratkohli, who was paid a hefty $1.8 million. And he averaged an insane 61.75 runs. This was one of Kohli's best IPL seasons. But for about 7 more runs on average, a player is getting paid $1.74 million more. Compared to Kohli, Stubbs is basically getting paid nothing, exactly 30 times less. And Stubbs isn't some absurd outlier here. Shashank Singh had a healthy average of 44.25 and maintained a strike rate of 164.65, 10 higher than Kohli's 154.69. And guess how much he got paid? The lowest band possible of $24,000. Anyone else noticing the trend here? IPL contracts seem to be poor indicators of performance. But how could that be? Aren't teams paying players to perform well? To make sure, let's check the correlations. First, let's look at bowling. Should be pretty reasonable to expect that bowlers that are paid higher are getting you more wickets. Wrong. The correlation between salary and wickets per innings is negligible and actually slightly negative at negative 0.04. Economy is slightly better, but still very weak at 0.17. Alright, let's look at batting then. And to make it clear, as we've done with other graphs, we're only looking at players who are meant to play this role. So we're only looking at dedicated batsmen here. We excluded all players who bowled in half or more of their matches. This means no tail-enders and no all-rounders. Players who might mess with and skew the data are not included. The correlations do look better here, but they're not strong. Let's step back for a second and take a look at what all this means. The charts we went through were crude measurements, but they show you just how much money teams have to play with. And the correlations along with the charts show that teams aren't quite paying for performance. Of course, this is all in hindsight, and you can't always predict how well a player will perform. No one is expecting selectors to get it completely right. After all, the real world is messy, but to see the amount of variability is insane. It almost doesn't make sense. Player pricing should follow one of the most basic principles of economics. For a better expected return on investment, teams should have to pay more. In simpler terms, if you want to pay for a player who performs above average, you're going to have to cough up extra money for him. IPL contracts were meant to be some predictor of how well a player performs that season. But clearly these IPL teams would have done better by throwing darts at a wall. So what's going on? What if player performance wasn't the main concern? At least not consistently. This would explain all of our relatively weak correlations. But if stats don't tell the full story, how are teams determining what a fair price is for a player? What if I told you we're thinking about it all in the wrong way? that from the start, we set out to answer the wrong question. It's all actually pretty simple. Of everything we looked at so far, the stat that is best correlated with the player's salary isn't even related to cricket. The key to a successful payday was sitting right under our noses the entire time. You might have already guessed it. It's actually pretty simple. We pay for this all the time ourselves. Just like the insane investor valuations behind crypto and AI startups, teams will pay for hype. Of all the things we looked at so far, you'll see that this might be the best explanation for why some players get paid more than others. The names that will bring the most attention to their franchise will ultimately go for top dollar. Players who can generate the most hype, the ones who everyone will be talking about, are the most attractive players to teams. After looking at all the data, we compared players' salaries to their Instagram following, and we found the most convincing correlation thus far. Finding every single IPL player's Instagram following and comparing it to their salary is very time-consuming. So we did something that's just as valid for the world of stats, a stratified random sample. We broke down the players according to their pay bands and then randomly sampled a roughly proportional number of players from each group, and we made our comparisons from there. This sounds like a lot of steps, but what the results reveal is much more worth it. Here's what we found. 65% of the variation in player salary is explained by how many Instagram followers a player has. Before you ask, these Instagram followings were pulled from a date prior to the IPL auction in December 2023. We aren't saying that Instagram following is the end-all be-all behind salaries, but keep in mind that for all other metrics we've looked at before this, we never even got a strong correlation. And those are some of the most core and basic stats that any commentator would talk about. Turns out, all along, the IPL auction might not be about expected performance. And sure, we know that players with higher salaries will probably end up doing decently well, but they will always be overpaid. That is, if you only think about performance. Correlation is not the same as causation, but the fact that follower counts are miles ahead of the most basic player performance metrics means it's worth taking popularity seriously. But okay, what are teams getting exactly from throwing money at these big names? The answer is profits. The more these teams can generate hype, the more people will buy jerseys and pack stadiums, and the more sponsorship money you'll see pouring in. If you don't believe me, we can see this play out ourselves. Let's take a look at team valuations. You'll see all 10 of the current IPL teams listed and ordered by their 2024 valuations. What is RCB doing so high up here? RCB has notoriously never secured a championship, and yet it finds itself being the second most valuable team in the IPL. CSK has won 5 championships to end up at the top, and they are barely in front of RCB. Not only that, but RCB is 2 spots ahead of Mumbai Indians, who also won 5 championships, the record amount. So RCB, which is one of the richest teams in the IPL and has never won a cup, continues to be one of the most popular teams. And it's no wonder why. Viratkohli is one of their main ambassadors, and they've featured star-studded players, and it shows how teams are okay paying insanely for players even if they don't get to put silverware on the shelf. These players are investments for brand value, and that's why teams will pay much more than is seemingly justified for the most recognizable guys. Selling jerseys and packing stadiums is one thing. Sponsorships are a whole nother game. And sports jerseys alone allow for up to 10 sponsorships. All you have to do is follow the money. Let's look at how IPL teams get compensated. This is where we really get to understand what's going on. In recent years, the prize money for winning the whole IPL is around $2.4 million. By comparison, RCB has earned 8 times that at a staggering $18.6 million, all from just sponsorships in 2024. And we haven't even mentioned tickets or merchandise. If I'm a team owner, I'm looking for big names like Kohli and Stark, players who will probably bring me more money than winning the IPL ever will. When we start to think about things in this perspective, we start to understand why some players are worth so much more. And it's evident that teams look at players as investments. Look at RCB. It's owned by USL, India's largest alcoholic beverages company, and the second largest producer of liquor by volume in the world. This company is massive. And yet, in the 2023 season, revenue from RCB made up about 16% of USL's net profits. 2 years ago, that number was just 8%, and we don't even have the data from 2024. which was the IPL's most successful edition. If you're USL, you really don't care about winning as much as you care about driving those net profits up. And of course, the players who build hype are usually deserving of it because of their performances in the past. So this strategy kind of works out. You see, what actually happens is that it turns out that hype is somewhat of a proxy for performance. Look how star-studded both Mumbai Indians and CSK are, for example. But ultimately, the number of people teams can captivate is much more important than actually winning the championship, at least from the perspective of making money. But what does this all mean for cricket as a sport? In all professions, we like to think that people are paid for how hard they work. The better you do, the better you'll be compensated. But maybe this rule isn't quite broken. These players who are big names didn't just get this way overnight. Each one of them has had to face increasing scrutiny the more popularity they gained. Very few people in this world have faced the amount of pressure that someone like Kohli has. He's literally faced calls to be dropped, was labeled a slow player, and had to somehow persist through a string of weak performances while stepping down as captain. He faced expectations that would crush anyone else. Bumrah, a household name for Mumbai Indians, faced criticism since childhood for his bowling action. We actually covered Bumrah's rise to the top in our previous video, and if you want to know the hardships and challenges he faced, check our channel out. All of this to say, to be at the top, you have to do it all with people spinning narratives against you. And doesn't that qualify for some kind of compensation? As fans of the IPL, we're here to watch the biggest names in the world duke it out against each other. We want to watch titans and legends gunning for all the glory. And it's probably true, teams would much rather have huge names repping their gear even if they're paying out of their minds. After all, isn't that grandiosity part of the league's magic? It's safe to say that the IPL has shaken waves. And this is made possible in large part because these teams are willing to pay insane amounts so that us fans can witness some of the most epic moments cricket has to offer.